Or I more or less assumed you guys ain't got time for this. So Pam from Cannot Be Tamed kindly dropped by the channel a few months ago and left this pearl of wisdom. I can only think of a few policies I have, and her third rule is, stop playing games I'm not enjoying, no waiting for them to get good. Ah, such wisdom in the YouTube comment section. I didn't have this policy before, but last year I decided to adopt it. Because grinding a game to get your money's worth is a waste of time, which adds to the waste of money that comes with buying games that you don't like. So from now on, if I don't like a game, I'll just let it go, let it go. But I thought I'd just bundle together some of the titles that I played last year that I didn't tell you about, that didn't get their own video, either because I didn't finish them or because I didn't think you'd be interested in what I had to say about them, given the Stray experience. Yeah, they didn't like you, Ninja. And just so that you don't let the demon of your hatred loose upon the comment section of this video, know that I think that some of these games are actually great. So I'll be using my regular system of tiers to categorize them: the great, the good, the meh, the bad, and the ugly. Also, know that I have sorted this list from best to worst using an expectations versus reality coefficient, so to speak. So without further ado, here's the list. The great, Hades. Hades is an isometric roguelike action game with RPG elements, and I think it's amazing. Combat is the bread and butter of this game, and it is super tight, if a little bit busy from time to time. Hacking, slashing, dodging, and defending with those weapons that allow it feels super responsive and gratifying, even for someone who's rusty as fuck when it comes to these games. And on the enemy end of things, I also think the devs nailed everything. The variety, the hitboxes, the timing and telegraphing of the attacks, the speed of projectile attacks, and the strength of impact versus recovery time coefficient. Yep, color me impressed with this one. As a roguelike, Hades also has some pretty decent replay value. There's randomized rooms, randomized boss talents, achievements, skills and weapons that you can unlock and purchase with the resources you gather during every run, and this ever-increasing array of mechanics is relayed in a way that does not overwhelm the player. The story in Hades is straightforward and unpretentious, and although it is very clear what you have to do and what everyone's angle is about everything at all times, every run you're still treated to interesting bits of lore, new conversations, and new characters as you try again and again to make it out of that hellhole. Literally this time. There are games in which you can't quite tell if the game is deliberately trying to be lighthearted or if it's meant to be taken seriously. And when this happens, it's because the developers couldn't quite convey the game's narrative tone properly. And that's not the case with Hades. If nothing else, I think Hades is the perfect example of a game whose lore is deeply rooted in Greek mythology, but at the same time, right from the get-go, it lets you know that it doesn't take itself too seriously. The deliberate use of modernized English and modern-day expressions, the comical depiction of gods like Hermes or Dionysius, and the overall lighthearted demeanor of the game constitute a very clever approach to narrative design. There are a few things that I don't like about this game, but these are things that are just not to my personal liking. There's nothing wrong with them per se. For example, because it is a roguelike, it can get a little bit frustrating and tiresome to hack through the same hordes of monsters time and time again to clear zones that you have already conquered. Also, while the game features solid level design and combat takes place in rooms that are varied and interesting, there's little else to do in these rooms other than beat the crap out of everything that stands in your way. There are no hidden rooms or corridors, no secret chests, nothing to sate your thirst for exploration. There are a few pots that you can go full Link mode on every now and then, and there's a fishing game of sorts, but that's about it. The bits of the story that are revealed after every run also felt a little bit undeserved to me. I think if I had done much worse or much better, I still would have gotten the same new dialogues and I still would have met the same new characters after every run. At least that's not the case with skills, talents, and weapons that you can purchase. The better you play the game, the cleverer you are choosing your next room during every run, the faster these perks will become available to you. On the artistic end of things, Hades knocks it out of the park. The graphics, the music, and the voice acting are all amazing and 100% in tune with the game's theme, but also with its tone and personality.
He's got a great personality.
Cerberus is a giant demonic three-headed dog and a pampered puppy who enjoys to be petted at the same time. Medusa is a gargon that has snakes for hairs, and people around the house call her Dusa, and she is in charge of cleaning duties. And this is what she looks and sounds like.
What? You really mean it, Prince? Thank you. Thanks so much.
And this is what Dionysius, god of wine, sounds like.
Hey, Zach, got to tell you, I cannot believe that little Artemis is hanging out with you. She doesn't hang with anybody, man.
That should tell you all you need to know about this game's personality. And if it doesn't, here's a bit of the soundtrack. Not exactly Orpheus playing his lute, is it? Which, by the way, is the only character that I find unbearably off in this game. The only flaw that I can think of in Hades is that when characters talk during boss encounters, the way they made it work was to lower the volume of the music, and that's not very good mixing. Hades currently goes for $25.99 on Steam, which isn't exactly a Black Friday bargain for a roguelike indie game. But even at this price, I'd say Hades deserves a bad motherfucker and a ye old gamer recommends seal of approval. The good, Wildermyth. Wildermyth is a story-driven CRPG with turn-based combat mechanics. And when I say story-driven, I'm not fucking around. This one is borderline a choose-your-own-adventure comic book that has a player engaging in combat from time to progress further into the story. And it has a few additional mechanics that effectively add to the immersion and adventure aspects of the game. It also has its fair share of procedurally generated stuff, like scenarios, side quests, and some other things. Actually, after my first day with the game, I was ready to give it a ye old gamer recommends seal of approval, and tell you all about it on its own video. Because Wildermyth's core premise is original, fresh, exciting, and just the spin of the wheel the RPG genre has been needing this last 20 years if you ask me. Wow, that sounds like awfully high praise, doesn't it? And in the hands of a different development team and different writers, this might have actually turned out to be an earth-shattering, game-changing title. So what's the game's premise and where did it go wrong? In Wildermyth, there are several self-contained adventures for you to choose from and play. Some are immediately available from the get-go, while others require you to unlock them by finishing the initial stories. All of them are standalone stories, though they do share some of the lore, and even player-created characters may carry over from one story to another. The bulk of the adventure is presented in a comic book-like fashion, with vignettes and everything. At the beginning of each adventure, you have to create as many characters as are needed for that particular story. And these guys and gals you create become the initial protagonists of the adventure. The first story, for example, is about a group of 3 friends who set out on a journey out of pure wanderlust. While the one called Eluna and the Moth is about 2 siblings who embark on a moonstruck journey through tragedy and time, as the game itself describes it. So for this last story, you'll be required to create 2 characters who are siblings. In the character creation interface, you can customize their appearance, you can choose their backgrounds, and you can even assign priorities to their personality traits. And one thing that all these stories have in common is that at some point you'll have to form a company of heroes and give it a name. And this becomes an important thing in the game regardless of which story you play. People will refer to you as a group by your company's name. Your company may gain notoriety amongst the common folk, and even stoke the interest of a young peasant or 2 who might want to join your merry band of adventurers. These stories are structured in chapters, and some of them span over many years and even decades. Your adventurers get old, they have children who are recruited into your company of heroes, some of them die in battle, and some live long enough to become heroes and retire. In the longer stories, for example, the protagonist of the story may end up being a new recruit you signed into your company during the second chapter of the adventure, at a time in which your initial protagonists were already seasoned heroes renowned all throughout the lands. And it is really quite remarkable that the game takes into account many of the things that happen to your heroes over the course of the adventure. Your characters, for example, appear in this comic book-like vignettes, wearing all the gear and special items they find throughout the journey. And this is impressive because you may assign the loot you find after every combat encounter to whichever character you want, which means these vignettes are generated dynamically. Also, some of your heroes may be severely injured in battle and become permanently maimed. And when that happens to a character, he or she will be shown in the vignette wearing an eye patch or a wooden leg, for example, depending on the injury. Your adventurers also age over the course of the years, and because some of these stories span over decades, their hairs become progressively grayer and their skins become more and more wrinkled as the story advances. It also blows my mind out of this world, the fact that the story takes into account some of the most fortuitous stuff that happens to your party as a consequence of your actions. Let me give you a few examples of how this works. For most dungeons, and yes, this game has dungeon crawling in its own special way, you'll be walking about with a party of 5 adventurers. That's the standard party size in Wildermyth for most of the stories. But at some point your company of heroes will have many more than 5 adventurers, so it is a good idea to keep everyone busy at all times. You can send some of them to build defenses around the town, you can have them build bridges, craft items, or defend a town from a monster invasion. At the top of your map interface you'll see the remaining days before the next monster invasion so that you can plan accordingly. And you definitely want to be prepared for this. You want to thwart these invasions as soon as possible, believe me. So let's say you send 2 of your trusty adventurers out to build some defenses around an unprotected town. And while they are on their way, a random side quest triggers for these 2. The stories in these randomly generated side quests have a ton of vignettes with a ton of dialogue, several NPCs, MacGuffin chases, and so on and so forth. And whenever these side quests trigger, they are exclusive to the characters who trigger them, because they were the ones who happened to be at the right place at the right time, or wrong, depending on how things turn out. And over the course of these side quests, the characters involved will likely develop a bond. And if later on in the game one of them is forced to leave combat, it will be that person with which they shared that little side quest who will prompt them to leave the battlefield and save themselves, and not any other member of your party. During those peaceful downtimes that elapse between one chapter and the next, there are little story bits that tell you about what your adventurers were up to during that time. And those characters who happened to share one of those random side quests are shown spending time together during these interludes, often reminiscing about that one special adventure they shared. The stories also keep track of who dies during combat. There was this one story, for example, that I barely managed to complete. Only 2 characters made it to the end out of the party of 9 who entered the final dungeon. One of them was, of course, the dwarfy looking badass one. In the story, this structured comic book-like story with vignettes filled with dialogue and narration, I remind you, acknowledged the fact that only those 2 people survived. The vignettes that followed the climax of the story showed only those 2 people rounding things up and walking away into the sunset, so to speak. And if this all sounds ridiculously awesome, it's because it is. Actually, I think Wildermyth's premise is way smarter and more exciting than it has any right to be. So where did it go wrong? Why is this game good but borderline meh? Well, I'd like to bring up a conversation some of you guys were having in the comment section to explain myself. Leandro Bandeira had this to say: in RPGs, I'm all about the story and characters. As a rule of thumb, if both are interesting enough, then I would probably endure through an easier or harder than average game. And see, that is one of the problems with Wildermyth. Neither the stories nor the characters are particularly interesting. I guess you could say the stories are hit or miss if you want to be generous. The stories titled Enduring War and Monarchs Under the Mountain were okay. There were high stakes, interesting locations, and Monarchs Under the Mountain in particular had somewhat decent NPCs. But once you've completed 2 or 3 of these stories, you'll come to the realization that your characters' personalities are just a game of smoke and mirrors. Your playable characters are really just empty husks, placeholder for whatever conversation needs to happen to advance the story. No one is consistently optimistic or cynical, no one's the jokester of the group, no one's the selfless hero or the coward of the party. Everything everyone says in this game could have perfectly been said by any other character. So after a couple of stories, the mask fell off and it broke my heart. And when that happened, I found myself speed clicking through most of the game's many, oh so many chunks of story. It also doesn't help that many of these story bits add nothing to the story, tell us nothing about the setting or about the characters. Which takes us to the second problem with the stories in Wildermyth. Pantone ARQM gave a colorful answer to Leandro's comment. See what I did there? No? Yeah, okay. He said, if RPGs for you are all about story and characters, then maybe you should try reading a book. And now that I think of it, Wildermyth is probably as close as you are going to get to the book experience in a role-playing video game. And even this being the case, I'm not crazy eager to recommend this game to Leandro or to any of you for that matter. I consider myself first and foremost a story guy, and even I feel like the number of vignettes in this game
is too damn high.
And it's too damn high because there is too much pointless build-up to plot points and events that have no significant impact in the larger scheme of things. Also, the quality of the writing is wildly inconsistent. Sometimes it's beautiful and immersive, and sometimes it fucks up even very basic grammar. I'm pretty sure I'm not the intended audience for the stories in this game. The game does not bother to show how the rules of its own fantasy world work. It doesn't care to elaborate upon the world's peoples and their history, the dialogue is kept simple and to the point, mature themes and conundrums are avoided, characters are depicted as straight out evil or good. It's for kids, I get it. 10 to 15-year-olds, I would say. But if I had to bet, I don't think many of them are going to be oh boying and oh wowing about this one. Then Ilithas Viramar chipped in and said, still, an RPG will let you experience the story as the protagonist and tailor it to the way you want to play it, by letting you make your own decisions, for example. And this makes me think, holy shit, that's it. That's the main problem with Wildermyth. The game can't be bothered to present you with a single fucking decision story-wise. You can't decide to go to X or Y place on the map, and that will result in X or Y bit of the story being revealed. The thing is that some of the stories funnel you into exploring its areas in a predetermined order. And the stories and those adventures, perhaps because they are more railroady, have a greater sense of narrative build-up. But unfortunately, this comes at the cost of you not being able to make any impactful decisions story-wise. Then there are some stories in which you can explore the map however you wish. And in those adventures, the story bits are a bit more self-contained, in the sense that nothing you do during these stories carries over to the next one. And that means that these chunks of story are perfectly interchangeable. And that in turn means that you could have done them in any order without altering the final outcome. So it's not like you are in the driver's seat of the story. And none of the decisions you are presented with in these vignettes have an impact beyond X bonus or Y penalty for the upcoming combat encounter. Wildermyth feels like the writers were much too proud of their stories and didn't want you fucking around with them, as opposed to, say, Tyranny, in which the developers clearly put all the effort in the world into making the story dance around your decisions and actions. And this truly is a crime if you consider that they could have easily put the player in the driver's seat of the story, because there are already so many things the game keeps track of that they could have put this already robust dynamic data design to good use story-wise. They just chose not to. And that's why there are still 2 or 3 stories left for me to play, and I don't think I will be playing them, or at least not for a while. Leandro says that he probably would endure through an easier or harder than average game if its story and characters are worth it. And here's the thing with combat in Wildermyth. It's either significantly easier or significantly harder than the average game. That's right, there is no average difficulty in Wildermyth. The Adventurer difficulty, which is the default difficulty for this game, is laughably easy. It's almost harder to fail a combat encounter than it is to beat it. And the Tragic Hero difficulty, which is the one immediately above the Adventurer difficulty, is so freaking hard that it makes the longer stories in the game almost impossible to finish if you play the game as a roguelike, which is how you are meant to play Wildermyth, I think. And this is especially frustrating in Wildermyth because while your average run in roguelikes like Slay the Spire, Tainted Grail Conquest, or Hades may take about an hour, the longer stories in Wildermyth might take a couple of days to complete. Thankfully, Wildermyth gives you the option to play the game as a regular CRPG, and by this I mean that you'll get the chance to save and restore whenever you feel like it. You can also play it as a roguelike to spice up the adventure with a feeling of danger if you wish. But if your plan is to milk the fun out of the game's combat, you might want to choose a higher difficulty level and play the game the non-roguelike way. Wait, isn't the combat worth doing that though in this game? It has its moments. It can be challenging and exciting from time to time. Challenges are varied. Some fights are about escaping a location, others are about holding the line, others are dramatic multi-scenario situations, and I found the final stretch for each of the stories to be particularly interesting on the combat end of things. and I really wasn't expecting it to be this good, telling by how your characters, combat scenarios, and combat animations look like in this game. So I guess there is that. Enemy variety is awesome, and I like that each story has its own cast of bad guys, and some of the talents these guys have and the challenge they pose will have you scratching your head about how to go on about the fight, and this is always a positive thing. Also, the level layout for these combat encounters constitutes another variable to pay attention to, and that always adds to the challenge and enjoyment in games with turn-based combat. This game has only 3 classes and no archetypes, although there are talents that allow you to build a warrior, for example, as a DPS specialist or as a tank. I'm not at all a fan of how magic works in Wildermyth though. Mystics, which is what mages are called in this game, don't have spells that they can use however and whenever they wish. Magic in this game depends on the interactable objects that are lying around in the locations where the fights take place. If there's a pile of rocks, for example, then you can turn it into a stone projectile and hurl it at a bad guy. But if you happen to like that spell, and you've decided that rock hurling is going to be your thing, you're going to have a hard day at the office, because there are locations where there won't be any rocks for you to turn into projectiles. So it's not like you can have a favorite spell and use it as the bread and butter of your tactics. For whatever reason, and I certainly didn't plan it that way. Last year I ended up playing more games with turn-based combat mechanics than I regularly do in a year. There was the Temple of Elemental Evil, Solasta Crown of the Magister, Tainted Grail Conquest, Circus Electrique, Expeditions Rome, Underrail, and some others that we are going to mention on this video. And if we rate all these games by the quality of their combat, Wildermyth is easily below average compared to all those other titles. It's not bad, it's just not great either. I guess that the fact that your characters look like static little paper figures that hop around the battlefield doesn't help either. And while I think the art package is very consistent and pleasant to look at and listen to in this game, and yes, the music is
amazing
in this game, combat animations feel like the one embarrassing, painful exception to this. And listen, this game would be squarely good tier in my book and not borderline meh if it weren't for the fact that this game goes for $24.99 on Steam, so almost exactly as much as Hades. And these are different games, of course, but as much as I prefer RPGs to action games with RPG elements, if you are going to spend $25 on an indie roguelike, I think Hades has a much better chance of making you feel like you got your money's worth. The meh Inscryption. Inscryption is a tactical card game that takes the genre for a spin, and it does so by introducing Inception levels of 4th dimensional meta mystery and plot twists. Many people consider this game to be the best indie game of the year 2021, and if you check the game's average score on Steam and Good Old Games, you'll see that the general consensus is that the game is awesome. But despite its immersive ambiance, despite the masterful way in which it handles its mystery, and despite its clever 4th dimensional narrative, it is still for the most part a card game. And as a card game, it is not great. It's actually kinda bad. If you are thumping Inscryption because you are looking for a challenge a la Slay the Spire, this is not the game for you. That's all you need to know before we take a deep dive into the waters of
Massive spoilers.
And I'm talking Bruce Willis is dead throughout the entire movie, or Brad Pitt and Edward Norton are the same person level of spoilers here. You have been warned. There is a timecode in the description section if you want to move on to the next game. The card game your character plays inside the game is called Inscryption, just like the game you paid $20 for. So for the sake of sanity, we are going to be referring to the card game itself as the Inscryption card game. Well, the Inscryption card game has 2 variants. Let's call the first variant the roguelike variant, and the second variant the RPG deck building variant, just to keep things neatly taxonomized for the sake of this mini review. The roguelike variant is the one you'll be playing the most. You'll be playing it in Act 1, Act 3, and the epilogue of the game, while the RPG deck building variant, which is the one I happen to like the most, is only used during the second act of the game. And the roguelike variant has 2 presentations, because it doesn't work exactly the same every time it's featured. The Act 1 presentation feels a bit like a poor man's Slay the Spire. You sit at a table to play cards against some mysterious entity with untold supernatural powers, and he presents you with a series of maps which have branching paths with nodes, and these nodes can be regular combat encounters, elite combat encounters, or events of various types. Does that sound familiar? The roguelike variant of the Inscryption card game is not great, but it's also not terrible per se. It's got solid rules, and its mechanics are easy to learn and easy to master too. But again, this game is more about wowing you with its fourth dimensional plot twisty narrative and spooky ambiance than about challenging your tactical card game skills. But this first presentation of the roguelike variant of the game doesn't have too many cool card synergies for you to experiment with, nor does the game require you to be good with the few of them it actually has. And there are too many easy ways to upgrade or craft cards that are ridiculously overpowered. But the worst problem with this first presentation of the roguelike variant of the game is that there aren't too many ways to keep your deck lean. You can't skip card rewards, for example, and there are only a couple of events that allow you to merge or sacrifice cards. I even got the impression that the developers simply didn't know that making your deck as lean as possible is kind of a #1 unwritten rule in all these card games. In Act 3, PO3 says something along the lines of, "You have to sacrifice a card. Don't complain, that's how you make your deck more consistent." So I guess they did know about the first unwritten rule of card games, but for some reason they chose to ignore it during the first act of the game. Because to be fair, the second presentation of the roguelike variant of the card game does not have this problem, because you have to click on card rewards if you're interested in getting new cards, but you may totally choose not to do this. It's still not perfect though, because if you click on the card reward icon, you have to choose a card. And there also seem to be many more mechanisms available for you to get rid of cards in this second presentation of the roguelike variant. This variant of the card game also features a few non-card rewards, like totems and consumables, and this is something you must have in a card game. Slay the Spire has its relics, Tainted Grail's got its consumables and runes, and Gwent has its leader abilities. The problem with these items is that, as it happens with the cards, some of them are just too motherfucking OP, and they will turn every encounter into a joke. In Slay the Spire, for example, the kunai relic is awesome to have if you play the silent and go for a shift-based strategy, for example, because it adds +1 dexterity for every 3 attack cards you play. And if you use a shift-based strategy, that means you'll be using plenty of skills and powers that spawn attack cards that cost 0 energy. And since dexterity is used to enhance your block cards, the kunai relic allows you to build defense dynamically as you attack. But the same relic is almost useless for someone who plays, say, the Defect, and uses an orb channeling strategy, for example. Totems, roughly speaking, are the Inscryption equivalent of relics. And this totem here, for example, 100% guarantees that you are going to win every encounter in Act 1, regardless of which deck you have, and regardless of whether you are good or bad at the game. So all you need to do is chase the totem event on the map until you get this particular totem. And yes, to make it even more convenient, every event type has its own icon on the map. So you'll always know what's coming up next, and this makes it super easy, barely an inconvenience, to chase the totem event and avoid those events you don't like or don't need. And I would say these OP items cheapen the strategic aspect of the game, if it actually had one. But the roguelike variant of the game does not have a strategic dimension worthy of being called such. Slay the Spire has characters, Tainted Grail Conquest has classes, Magic the Gathering has colors, and Gwent has factions. And these classes, colors, and factions constitute the strategic dimension in these games, broadly speaking. In Magic the Gathering, for example, if you want to go for a control strategy, you probably want to build a deck that is all blue or mostly blue. If you want to do the same thing in Gwent, the Nilfgaard faction is probably your best bet. But the roguelike variant in the Inscryption card game has nothing similar. The RPG deck building variant you play in Act 2 does, however, and that makes that variant way more interesting to play in my opinion. The RPG deck building variant of the Inscryption card game you play in Act 2 works less like Slay the Spire and more like a typical trading card game like Gwent or Magic the Gathering. There are 4 scribes whose deck you can choose as the foundation for your strategy. You have Leshy, Magnificus, Grimora, and PO3, and each of them has its own set of cards. Leshy, for example, specializes in animals, Grimora has skeletons and ghosts, Magnificus has magic, and PO3 has tech cards, and each of these sets has its own philosophy and its own array of viable strategies. Also, the RPG deck building variant allows you to build your deck much like you do in Gwent or Magic the Gathering, and every time you defeat someone you get to open a booster pack that contains common and uncommon cards and a single rare one. You can also find cards in bins, shelves, chests, and crates as you explore the different locations you can visit in Act 2. This act, by the way, looks and feels as though it had been made with RPG Maker. I really didn't like this change of style, not because I don't like the style per se, I actually do, but because I think it was much too disruptive of the game's original look and feel. I get why they did it, but it didn't work for me. And although I eventually ended up enjoying this part of the game more than Act 1, especially because of its card mechanics and its old-fashioned RPG look and feel, I already felt like the game had outstayed its welcome by this moment. I remember saying, wait, there's more? Little did I know that I was going to say that several more times over the course of what remained of the game. Act 3 goes back to the roguelike variant of the card game, but this presentation is slightly better than the one you get in Act 1. Instead of a map with branching paths and nodes a la Slay the Spire, you navigate an isometric scenario where there are clickable events that allow you to get new cards, enhance the ones you already have, get rid of cards, trade, etc. Also, the game spices up things in this third act by throwing in ad hoc rules for some encounters, and these remind me a bit of the puzzle events in Thronebreaker, only not as interesting, or as creatively designed, or as challenging. All in all, the card playing part of the game is just too freaking easy. I would say it's a card game for non-card game people. And I'm guessing those of you who are watching this video who have played this game and think it is deserving of the 9s and 10s it has been getting left and right these last 2 years are probably thinking, dude, you are missing the point here. This game is not about its card mechanics. It's great because it pushes the envelope, it takes fourth wall breaking to a whole new level, and it knowingly breaks every rule in the storytelling manual because that's what it needs to do to drive home its unique narrative concept. And all of this is true. Actually, this game has Inception levels of meta mystery, and this is where the game truly shines in my opinion. If it had been a puzzle game like Myst or The Seventh Guest from back in the day, I think I would have liked it a heck of a lot more.
He's got a great personality.
Yeah.
Yes, it does have a great personality. But I don't think that's enough to justify the 9s and 10s that everyone seemed to have given this game. This is first and foremost a card game. 85% of what you do in this game is play cards. And if I were to judge it solely as a card game, I would say it's a 6. And that's me being generous. But you know what? This game is like nothing you have ever played. Of that you can be absolutely sure. And for that alone I think it's still worth checking out, even if as a card game it's rather mediocre. I think Inscryption is one of those unique experiences in gaming that every gamer should play through all the way to the end, even if it's not exactly your jam. King Arthur, Knight's Tale. When someone says there's a new RPG out there that takes place in an Arthurian dark fantasy setting, you just go out there and buy the damn thing, no questions asked, especially if those in the know say it's good. Unfortunately, that policy didn't turn out all that well for me with King Arthur, Knight's Tale. In my book, this game is aggressively mediocre. It's not terrible, of course, but so far it has failed to meet just about every expectation I had about it. And I say so far because, well, there's a lot of people saying it will get better, trust me. So I am willing to break my new policy and give it a third chance, I suppose. There are a few things to like about this title. The game features beefy and tactically relevant stronghold management mechanics. If you play the game in harder difficulty levels, managing Camelot competently becomes crucial to your party's progress in the game. I think they succeeded in making combat and stronghold management interdependent parts of a solid cohesive whole. And stronghold management also involves item management, and this is also pretty decent in King Arthur Knight's Tale. Items have tactical relevance in this game, and some of them synergize well with your knight's class-specific skills, which is something that we don't see as often as we should in RPGs these days. Combat is intuitive in this game, and if you play it in any difficulty greater than the default difficulty, it's also challenging and it scales well as you progress through the game. There's also a decent, not great, but decent variety of enemies and combat situations. Sometimes you have to rush to one particular bad guy to stop it from spawning enemies, sometimes you're vastly outnumbered and have to figure out how to make the most out of your advantages, sometimes you must undo the enemy's tactical advantage a la Seeker type of challenge in the Slayer Seeker Survivor DLC for Pillars 2. But that's about all this game has going for it. Combat is meant to be this game's main pillar, and just as it happens with Wildermyth, if we make a list of every game that features turn-based combat that I've played this year and we sort them from best to worst, just by the quality of the combat, King Arthur Knight's Tale is easily below average, maybe even near the bottom. Some enemies look badass, I'll give them that, and some encounters require a certain degree of creative thinking. But the level design, for example, adds nothing interesting to the combat encounters, and most situations seem to boil down to dealing with enemies who outnumber you many times over. The bulk of the gameplay takes place in locations in which there's one main mission for you to complete, and sometimes one or two secondary missions. The missions are generic, and there's usually only one way to complete them. And because the game totally botches the mystery aspect of the story, I was never really invested in any of the things that were happening, or the mission at hand, or even the characters.
This is serious.
Yes, because we are talking about Sir Galahad, Sir Tristan, Sir Gawain, Balin the Savage, and just about every other motherfucking icon of Arthurian fantasy. And they somehow managed to make me not give a fuck about any of them. You play as Sir Mordred, risen from the dead, and your mission is to find out what happened to your former nemesis King Arthur after his death, and in the process reclaim Avalon from the mystical nightmares that have claimed it. And you do all this at the behest of the Lady of the Lake, who is purposefully mysterious about the whole deal, though I suspect this is going to lead to some plot convenient bullshit in the end. But all by itself, it's a pretty exciting premise, but the game does very little to make that matter to you personally, so chances are you won't give a flying fuck after a few minutes. The locations in which the action takes place are also painfully uninteresting. Exploration is reduced to wandering about and opening chests, or walking into combat encounters. There are no secret passageways to be discovered, or hidden areas locked behind this or that skill check, and on top of that, there's not much to look at in any of them. And you could say that locations are meant to be dark and rainy. It's Arthurian dark fantasy after all. Yeah, well, so is Tainted Grail Conquest. And in that game, half of the time I felt like I was about to shit my pants, and the other half I was trying hard to cope with the anxiety that I was getting from the very Kafkian situation I was being subjected to. The story in this game is little more than a footnote, and I am almost thankful it is. This is easily the most uninspired representation I've seen of the Arthurian myth. Compared to Tainted Grail Conquest's adequately dark and mysterious personality, this game feels a little bit like it doesn't know what it wants to be. The setting is meant to be dark and sinister, and the situation is meant to be foreboding, but many characters seem to be oblivious to this, and some even have an off-putting jolliness that does not suit the character or the situation. Most characters also use vocabulary and expressions that are inconsistent with the game's lore and tone. It's not as terrible as it is in other games, but it's enough to break your immersion. King Arthur Knight's Tale is not very well optimized either. Loading screens take longer than they should considering how small locations are, and there are a few moments here and there in which the frame rate drops noticeably. But the worst thing about King Arthur Knight's Tale is perhaps the game's price tag. Right now it still goes for $44.99. And now that I've played it for a few hours, for that price, I would say it's a hard pass. Maybe if I give it a third chance it'll change my mind, but I am not holding my breath. The bad.
There aren't any.
The ugly. Lost Eidolons. Every fiber of my gaming being seemed to whisper, "This game is not for you," in my ear whenever I watched footage or reviews of it. But no less than 3 of my favorite YouTubers gave it somewhat positive reviews. So because this game was supposed to be an RPG, and because of these somewhat positive reviews, I went and checked it out for myself. And I know that I shit on things from time to time, but you won't hear me say this too often. Lost Eidolons is shit. Even games that I positively do not like Black Geyser Couriers of Darkness, have a positive thing or two that are worth mentioning. like the final stretch of the game finally taking its combat seriously and giving you a proper challenge, or the decent character creation system, or the satisfying sound of you critting those vermin to hell and gone. But this title has nothing.
You got nothing! Nothing!
You got nothing. You could disappear tomorrow and who'd even know?
I repeat, Lost Eidolons is shit. So just like ripping off a band-aid is the best way to put that unpleasant experience behind you, I'll just give it to you fast and furiously. First, the story is shit. The story in Dragon's Dogma and Solasta Crown of the Magister are Miguel de Cervantes levels of writing compared to this clusterfuck. Everything that happens in this story is the product of someone doing something stupid or some nonsensical plot convenient bullshit. It's also boring as fuck, pretentious, cringe, and the information dumping is too damn high. Second, characters are shit. Characters in the Pathfinder games are elevated to Game of Thrones status when compared to this cast of imbecilic retards. Francisco, or Francisco, how they pronounce it in this game, is the only character that seems more or less consistent throughout the game, and he's the stereotypical brutish, arrogant dimwit you've seen a million times. Characters who are introduced as puny and doubtful immediately become resourceful and clever when the situation calls for it. Hot-headed characters are all of a sudden level-headed and reasonable because plot, and disagreeable characters cooperate just when the story needs them to. It's like the writers didn't know what they wanted these characters to be, and they were perfectly fine showing us a character acting in a completely reckless way one minute and asking everyone to think things through the next. Also, the way in which characters talk, behave, and reason in this game is straight out idiotic. Half of the time they say things that have nothing to do with what the other character said seconds ago, and the other half they say shit that adds nothing to the discussion, that doesn't tell us anything about who they are or the current situation. Dialogue is also over the top in an unrealistic and immersion-breaking way. It's like everyone here is too cool for school or painfully overly dramatic. Third, combat is shit. Combat in Encased feels like XCOM compared to this piece of turd. Combat in Lost Eidolons feels like it was pulled straight out of a pay-to-win mobile game. Also, the game's idea of variety is introducing new rules every combat encounter, tutorializing the living shit out of this new mechanics, and having your main PC or your companions explain what you have to do in autistic detail. It's also ridiculously easy, handholdy, and boring. And why do we need to watch some half-assed animation every fucking time we attack or get attacked? This works in games like Darkest Dungeon, Circus Electrica, and Vagrus because you have 4 fighters on each side, turns and battles are short, and you need that little token of dopamine to make it work. Take for example combat in Solasta Crown of the Magister. You get a little combat cutscene from time to time, but it's like 1 out of 10 or 15 moves, not every fucking time you do something. Also, most of the time, these animations show people who are not even participating in the fight. They're just standing around and cheering or whatever. This is hands down the worst turn-based combat I've experienced in the last decade. And that's because I don't want to bother looking further back in the past to cherry-pick a game that might have done it worse. Fourth, Lost Eidolons treats you like an idiot. Characters are constantly dumping information about what's going on, over-explaining shit you should be able to gather just by being there as an spectator, tutorializing the shit out of every mechanic and having characters explain what you have to do on top of that, quest marking every fucking NPC you have to talk to as part of a quest, auto-leveling your character without letting you have a say on the matter, not giving you a single dialogue option that may steer the story one way or another, and yeah, this game doesn't give a flying fuck about how you want to play it, what you want to do, or who you want to be. It's like they are saying, shut up and do as we say, you ignorant peasant. Fifth, questing is shit in this game. Quests in the Temple of Elemental Evil feel like they could be in The Witcher 3 when compared to this lame steaming pile of dog crap they call questing in Lost Eidolons. Every quest, every motherfucking quest in this game is talk to this person. And 80% of the time, you're acting like a courier of missives between 2 people who could have just talked to each other. Also, just to reiterate, you do not have dialogue choices here. You can choose the order in which to ask shit, that's about it. Sixth, character creation mechanics are non-existent and character progression is shit. You get this nice little screen. And aside from one lame-ass click that allows you to upgrade your character to a superior class, it's purely informative, because it thinks you can't handle it because you're dumb. Oh, and you only start moving your character around a location when you're like an hour into the game or so, and that just sucks ass. And I'm not even going to go into too much detail about some of the other issues that I have with this game, because compared to its biggest problems, they are nitpicks, like the fact that every character here seems to have time to go to the hair salon regularly, and it seems like the Vidal Sassoon look is all the rage in this medieval fantasy world, or the fact that these guys talk like modern day teenagers, or the horrible lip sync. I could go on forever. I will give this game 2 things and 2 things only. Graphics are mostly very good, character models are excellent actually, and the music is pretty decent and well mixed with the rest of the audio, but that's it. Take this review with 1, 2, or 3 grains of salt, because I couldn't stomach to play more than 1 hour of this superficial, vacuous, poorly designed, horribly written, and overall terribly put together piece of dog turd of a game. And listen, I know that burning $35 and scattering the ashes to the wind because the video game you bought with that money sucked ass is not the end of the world, even if it isn't easy to make $35 where I am from. I know it's frivolous to rant about a video game like this when, well, there are bigger problems that could be addressed with equal passion if you think of it, but this should give you a measure of just how bad this game is. It just brought out the worst in me. And you know what? The day I watched all these positive reviews and footage of Lost Eidolons on YouTube, that very same day, I also happened to read your recommendations of Bagros. And well, this is all I can say about this. You guys 1, favorite YouTubers 0.
And I have nothing more to say to you.
Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.